I was the one who bore this crushing burden all by myself for years of tears and silence. While building our life brick by brick as Warren laughed behind my back. That ungrateful man shattered my world, so we left with Hazel gripping my hand and Miles never looking back. Dear Warren, call me when you cool down, as if you could survive the truth of the secret fortune I hid and the ruin I planned just for you, along with our kids' inheritance you lost forever, and see how it all unfolds. And behind this unfolding tale stands a human creator, every calculated silence, every hidden fortune, crafted intentionally to mirror real triumphs you might recognize. If this is already hitting home, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. The restaurant was called Our Alias, and it smelled like money and lies. That is the only honest way I know to describe it. The kind of place where the bread comes warm in a linen napkin and the lighting is soft enough to hide the expression on a man's face when he thinks no one is truly watching him. I had chosen it myself, actually. I had made the reservation 3 weeks in advance, asked for the corner booth by the window that looked out onto the rain-slicked street, and I had worn the navy dress Warren once told me made my eyes look like deep water. I wanted everything about that evening to feel intentional. I wanted, even then, for the memory to be clean and precise, because some part of me already knew. The way you know a storm is coming hours before the sky turns. That the night would mark the end of something I had been quietly grieving for years. Warren arrived 7 minutes late. Not unusual. He kissed my cheek and smelled of cedar cologne and something underneath it. Something sweet and foreign that I had long since stopped letting myself identify out loud. He sat across from me, opened the menu with that particular ease he had always carried. That loose-limbed confidence of a man who has never once had to worry about whether the bill would clear. He had never had to worry because I had always made sure of it. For 22 years, I had made sure of it. I watched him order the ribeye without glancing at the price. I watched him wave his sommelier over and choose a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet. That cost more than our first month's rent on the apartment we shared when we were 26, and still believed in each other completely. I watched all of this, and I felt something very cold and very quiet settle into the center of my chest, and I recognized it for what it was. Not anger, not grief, clarity. We had been married long enough that silence between us had texture. That evening the silence felt like the surface of still water, just before something large moves underneath it. Warren spoke about a golf weekend he was planning with colleagues whose names I had heard before, but whose faces I had never been invited to see. He mentioned that his friend Douglas had a new boat, a 42-footer, and that they were thinking of taking it down the coast sometime in September. He mentioned these things the way a man mentions the weather, casually, without particular interest in whether you are listening. Because the point is never really the information itself. The point is the performance of a life that belongs entirely to him. I nodded. I sipped my water. I let him talk. Somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, his phone lit up on the table beside his bread plate. He had placed it face up, which was not unusual either. Warren had never been a subtle man. He glanced at it once, quickly, the way you check something you were already expecting, and the corner of his mouth did a thing I had memorized over to decades, a small involuntary softening, almost imperceptible, the kind of expression that has nothing to do with ribeye or Cabernet or boat trips. I had seen that expression directed at me exactly once on the night Miles was born, when Warren held our son for the first time and cried without embarrassment. I had not seen it directed at me since. Not in years. He turned the phone face down and looked up at me and said, "Sorry, work thing." And I said, "Of course." And I smiled and I cut my salmon. And I thought about the folder on my laptop at home, the one nested inside 3 other folders, labeled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but me. And I felt the cold clarity in my chest sharpen into something almost like peace. Dinner lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. We talked about Hazel's internship application, which I had helped her research and prepare. We talked about Miles's AP history exam, which I had quizzed him on that morning over breakfast. Warren offered opinions on both subjects with the authority of a man who had attended perhaps a dozen other school events combined across 17 years. I did not correct him. I never corrected him anymore. Correction had stopped being useful a long time ago. The drive home took 23 minutes. Warren drove, which he always preferred, and I sat in the passenger seat of the car I had leased and watched the neighborhood slide past the window. The houses in our district were large and well-lit, the kind of homes that broadcast stability to anyone passing by. Our house was among them, a colonial revival with a black front door and hydrangeas along the walk that I planted and pruned myself every spring. Warren had once told a colleague at a dinner party that he loved what he had done with the yard, and the colleague had laughed and complimented him, and Warren had smiled and accepted it. And I had stood 3 feet away holding a glass of white wine and said nothing at all. That was the texture of our life. That was what 22 years had become. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the light on in Hazel's window. She was home. Miles's light was off, which meant he had either fallen asleep early or was on his phone in the dark, which at 17 were essentially the same thing. I gathered my purse from the footwell, and I opened the car door and the night air came in cool and damp from the earlier rain, smelling of wet grass and turned earth, and I stood for just a moment before going inside. I stood there and I made a decision. Not dramatically, not with trembling hands or a racing pulse, quietly. The way you finally close a door you have been holding open out of habit, long after you stopped needing what was on the other side. I was going to end it. I was going to end all of it. And I was going to do it in a way that Warren would never see coming. Because the most powerful moves are always the ones made in complete silence, by the person everyone assumed was too tired to fight back. The drive home had been quiet in the way that only long marriages understand. Not the comfortable silence of two people at peace, but the pressurized silence of two people performing normalcy. So well they have forgotten they are performing it all. Warren hummed something low under his breath as he pulled into the garage, a habit he had when he was in a particularly satisfied mood. And the sound of it moved through me like a splinter. I recognized the satisfaction. I had seen it before, on evenings like this one, and I had always told myself I was reading too much into it. That night I stopped telling myself that. I went upstairs first under the pretense of washing off my makeup, which I always did before anything else when I came home from somewhere. That required the full version of me. The version with the pressed dress and the careful smile and the posture that said everything is fine here, everything has always been fine. I sat down at the small vanity in our bathroom and I looked at my reflection for a long moment. 48 years old, cheekbones that still held their shape, eyes that people had always called striking, a tiredness around the corners that no amount of sleep ever fully touched anymore. I had earned every one of those years. I had earned them in board meetings and school pickups and contractor calls, and insurance negotiations and quarterly tax filings in every single domestic and professional weight that had somehow, over 2 decades, migrated entirely onto my shoulders while Warren's remained perpetually mysteriously light. I removed my earrings and set them on the ceramic tray I kept beside the sink. I heard Warren downstairs, the refrigerator opening, the familiar percussion of his nightly routine. I dried my face and walked down the hall toward Hazel's room, where the light was still on. And I knocked twice with my knuckle, gently, the way I always had since she was small. She opened the door almost immediately. Hazel was 19 and home for the semester break, studying business administration at a university 3 states away. And she had my eyes and Warren's height and a mind that I had spent her entire childhood quietly, deliberately sharpening. She took one look at my face and stepped back to let me in without saying a word. That was one of the things I loved most about my daughter. She always knew when a situation required space before it required speech. I sat on the edge of her bed. She sat cross-legged on the chair at her desk and pulled her knees up to her chest and waited. The room smelled of the vanilla candles she always burned when she was studying, and there were index cards spread across her desk in neat color-coded rows. Even on break, she was preparing for something. She had always been like that, prepared, I said. I need to show you something. I said it quietly. Because Warren was 1 floor below us and the house carried sound in ways that still surprised me, after 15 years of living in it. I took out my phone and opened the banking app, not our joint checking account, not the household account Warren used freely and without discussion, but the business account tied to Nora Calloway Consulting LLC, the company I had incorporated 11 years ago and grown, steadily and without fanfare, into something that would have astonished Warren had he ever once bothered to ask. I turned the screen toward Hazel. She looked at it for a long moment. Her expression did not change dramatically. She had inherited my composure along with my eyes. But I watched the number register in her body, a subtle straightening of the spine, a slight parting of the lips. She looked up at me. "Mom," she said. "Just that." "I know," I said. "Does he know about this account?" "No," I said. "He has never asked about the business in any specific way. Not once in 11 years. Hazel was quiet for a moment, processing. That was the word for what she did, she processed. Like a very precise and thoughtful machine running calculations behind steady eyes. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I am going to be very careful and very patient and very thorough. And then I am going to make sure that you and your brother are protected no matter what happens next." She uncurled from the chair and came and sat beside me on the bed. And she took my hand in both of hers the way she used to when she was small and had a nightmare. Except this time, she was not the frightened one. She was holding my hand the way you hold something you intend to anchor. She was 19 years old and already steadier than the man who had helped bring her into the world, and the recognition of that landed in my chest with a grief and a pride so intertwined I could not separate them. We sat like that for several minutes without speaking. Downstairs, I heard the television come on. The low murmur of a sports recap Warren watched every night before bed. The same program, the same comfortable ritual, utterly unchanged. The normalcy of it was almost remarkable. The world he believed he was living in was intact and undisturbed, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman who had built every brick of it was sitting one floor above him with their daughter, having the first honest conversation about their future that did not include him at all. I squeezed Hazel's hand once and then let go, and I stood, and I straightened my dress out of habit. "Go to sleep," I told her. "We'll talk more in the morning. Don't say anything to your brother yet." She nodded. She understood instinctively that timing mattered, that the sequence of revelations was as important as the revelations themselves. I had raised her to understand these things. Without having to explain them, I walked back down the hall toward our bedroom. Warren was already in bed, phone on his chest, television still murmuring from the small set on the dresser. He looked up when I came in and gave me a comfortable, untroubled smile. The smile of a man without a single complicated thought in his head, and said, "Good dinner tonight." And I said, yes, it was. And I changed into my pajamas and got into bed beside him and lay in the dark, listening to him fall asleep, which took less than 8 minutes, as it always did. I lay there for a long time after his breathing evened out. I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the folder on my laptop. I thought about the attorney I had consulted quietly, once, for months ago, under the guise of updating my business estate planning. I thought about the conversation I would need to have with Miles, who was 17 and perceptive in a different way than his sister, Nora, more reactive, but fiercely loyal underneath all of it, the kind of loyal that once activated does not waver. I thought about the timeline I had been building in my head for the better part of 2 years. Quietly, the way you build anything that needs to last, one careful decision at a time. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. The house settled around me, making its small sounds. And outside the window the neighborhood was dark and still and rain-washed. And somewhere in the distance a car passed on the wet street with a sound like a long exhale. I closed my eyes. I was not afraid. I had moved past afraid a long time ago. Somewhere between the 3rd year of carrying everything alone and the moment I realized that carrying everything alone had also given me something Warren would never understand. I knew exactly where every single dollar was. Every account, every asset, every carefully placed brick of the life he thought belonged to him. Sleep came eventually, shallow and purposeful, like everything else I did. Morning in our house had always been my domain. Warren slept until 8:30 on weekdays and 10 on weekends, a luxury he had never once acknowledged as a luxury. And I had long since stopped resenting the sound of his unhurried breathing. While I was already downstairs at 6 with the coffee brewing and the calendar open and the mental architecture of the day being quietly assembled. That morning was a Saturday, which meant the house would be full longer than usual, which meant I needed to be more careful than usual about tone and expression, and the precise temperature of ordinary. I was at the kitchen island with my second cup of coffee when Miles came downstairs. He was still in the oversized gray sweatshirt he slept in, hair pushed to one side, eyes carrying that particular adolescent heaviness that has nothing to do with sadness, and everything to do with the sheer biological weight of being 17. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and stood at the counter and drank half of it before he said anything. Then he said, "You okay, Mom?" Just like that, unprompted. I looked at him over the rim of my mug. He was watching me with the directness he had always had, not Hazel's careful processing, but something more instinctive, a kind of emotional sonar that I suspected he had developed early, the way children in uncertain households sometimes do, learning to read the room before they learn to read a clock. I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking." He looked at me for one beat longer than necessary, then nodded, accepting this the way he accepted most things I said, with a trust that made my chest ache in a way I could not afford to indulge. That morning, Hazel came down 20 minutes later, dressed already, which told me she had not slept much either. She caught my eye over Miles's head and I gave her the smallest shake of my head. "Not yet," and she nodded and moved past me to the refrigerator and pulled out eggs, and began making herself breakfast with the focused efficiency of someone who needs something to do with her hands. The three of us moved around each other in the kitchen with the ease of long practice, the choreography of a household that had learned to function smoothly, with one member largely absent from its daily operations. Warren came downstairs at 9:47. I know the time precisely because I had been tracking it, the way I tracked everything that mattered, not obsessively, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has learned that details are the difference between a plan that holds and a plan that collapses at the worst possible moment. He was freshly showered in khakis and a collared shirt, looking rested and unhurried and entirely at ease in a kitchen. He could not have located the dish soap in without asking. He said good morning to all three of us with the broad warmth of a man who believed himself to be a present and beloved father, and Miles said good morning back. And Hazel said it too. And I said it too, and we all performed the first act of a Saturday with the polish of people who have performed it many times before. He made himself coffee. He sat at the head of the island. He picked up his phone. I watched him read something on the screen. I watched a small private softening happen at the corner of his mouth again, the same expression from the restaurant, less than 12 hours later, and I watched him angle the phone very slightly away from the rest of us without appearing to, a gesture so habitual by now that I doubted he even knew he was doing it. Miles was looking at his own phone. Hazel was eating her eggs and reading something on her laptop. Neither of them appeared to notice. I noticed. I always noticed. I had been noticing for years. My phone buzzed on the counter beside me. A WhatsApp notification. Warren's name. I picked it up and read it without changing my expression, which by now was a skill I had refined to something very close to an art form. Hey, Dutch, you seemed quiet at dinner. Everything all right with you? Just making sure you're okay. A pause. Then a second message arriving immediately after. I was thinking maybe we could do something nice. This weekend. Just us. You deserve a break, babe. I set the phone face down on the counter. Babe. He called me babe on WhatsApp when he wanted something to feel smooth. When there was a small atmospheric disturbance in his domestic world and he wanted to flatten it before it became inconvenient. I have received variations of this message perhaps 40 or 50 times over the past several years, always after an evening where I had been quieter than usual, always with the same texture of generosity that was actually a form of management. You deserve a break, as though a break were something he had the authority to grant, as though the thing I needed was a weekend outing chosen by the man whose credit cards I was still paying off. I picked the phone back up and typed, I'm fine. Thank you. 3 words, warm enough not to alarm, short enough to offer nothing. I set it down again. 2 minutes later, another message, you sure? You know you can talk to me about anything. Followed by a heart emoji, an actual heart emoji, red and round. Dropped into the conversation with the casualness of a man who believed that symbols could substitute for substance. Hazel's laptop pinged softly, and she glanced at her screen and then at me. And I saw in her expression that she had just received something, not from Warren, but from the secondary email account I had set up for her 3 months ago. The one I used occasionally to forward documents I needed her to have access to. I had sent her something late the night before after Warren fell asleep, a summary document, 3 pages, clean and precise, outlining the structure of the business accounts, the investment portfolio, the real estate holdings in my name alone, and the rough shape of what I intended to do with all of it. I had wanted her to come to breakfast informed. She closed the laptop gently and finished her eggs and carried her plate to the sink and rinsed it without a word. Miles, still on his phone, swiveled slightly on his stool and said to Warren, almost conversationally, Hey, Dad, did you end up going to that thing Thursday night? Warren looked up from his own phone and said, What thing? And Miles said, I don't know. I thought I heard you mention something. And Warren said, Oh, just met up with some guys from work. Nothing exciting. He said it easily, without hesitation. The way you say something you have said so many times it no longer requires construction. Miles looked at his phone again. He did not look at me. But I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten once, briefly, and then relax. And I understood that my son, my 17-year-old son who fell asleep on the couch, watching action movies, and still called me mom in the same voice he had used at 8 years old, had just heard something and filed it away somewhere behind those steady dark eyes. And that whatever I had been protecting him from, he was no longer entirely ignorant of. The morning continued. Warren ate toast. He refilled his coffee. He mentioned the golf weekend again, to no one in particular, in the satisfied tone of a man narrating his own contentment. And I sat at the island and I listened and I thought about the phone call I had scheduled for Monday morning with my attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei who wore small gold glasses and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who had seen every variation of the story and never once been surprised by any of them. I thought about Patricia's voice on the phone from months ago, calm and precise, walking me through the concept of a domestic asset protection trust, the mechanics of transferring ownership, the timeline required to make everything unassailable. I thought about the words she had used, elegant, to describe the structure I had outlined for her. Elegant. Yes, that was exactly the right word. Not brutal, Not vindictive in any visible way. Elegant, the way the best kinds of justice always are. Warren's phone buzzed again, and he excused himself from the island and walked toward the living room, still looking at the screen. Already gone from the room in every way that mattered before he had even left it, Hazel looked at me across the island. Miles looked up from his phone and looked at Hazel and then at me, and something passed between the three of us in that kitchen, wordless, instantaneous. The kind of communication that does not require language because it is built from years of shared understanding. And I knew, with a certainty I felt in my bones, that my children were with me. Both of them. Completely. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one. That Sunday night I waited until the house went completely quiet. Warren was asleep by 10:15, as reliable as a clock. And I lay beside him for 20 minutes listening to his breathing settle into the long, even rhythm of a man without a single troubled thought. Then I slipped out from under the covers, picked up my laptop from the nightstand, and walked barefoot down the hall to the small home office I had always kept locked to detail. Warren had never questioned. Because Warren had never been curious about the mechanics of a life he had not built, I closed the door behind me. The desk lamp threw a warm cone of light across the surface, and I sat down and opened the laptop, and navigated to the folder nested 3 levels deep, the one with the string of numbers for a name. And I opened it and looked at everything I had assembled over the past 2 years with the quiet focus of someone who does not get a second chance to do this correctly. There were 6 accounts in total. The joint checking, which Warren used freely, and which I had deliberately kept lean, enough to look normal, never enough to represent real weight. The household savings, similarly managed. And then the 4 accounts that existed entirely outside the version of our finances Warren believed in: the business operating account for Nora Calloway Consulting LLC, the investment brokerage account I had been funding steadily for 9 years, the high-yield savings account I had opened under the business umbrella, and the account I thought of privately as the architecture account, the one where I had been placing, with patience and precision, the capital I intended to transfer to my children. I opened the banking app on my phone and I began. Not dramatically. The most significant financial decisions of my life had the texture of administrative work, a series of careful transfers, threshold amounts that stayed below reporting triggers, timed across a window of days I had already mapped out with Patricia's guidance. I moved a precise amount from the brokerage into the architecture account. I updated the beneficiary designations on 2 of the investment accounts, changes that required only a password and a confirmation email, and became legally binding. The moment I clicked submit, I reviewed the draft documents Patricia had sent me, the ones that would formalize the trust structure, and I noted the 3 items she needed me to verify before Monday morning. Outside the window the neighborhood was dark and absolutely still. Somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and then went silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming faintly from the kitchen below, and the small tick of the house cooling in the night air, and underneath all of it the vast, pressurized quiet of a life on the edge of its own transformation. I thought about the first year of our marriage, when Warren had lost his job at the logistics company, and I had picked up 2 additional consulting contracts, without telling him how much I was working so that he would not feel ashamed. I thought about the year Hazel was born, when I returned to full-time work at 11 weeks because the mortgage was 3 months from default and Warren was still, as he described it, figuring out his next move. I thought about every school tuition payment, every car lease, every home repair negotiation, every tax document, every insurance renewal, the 10,000 invisible labors that had kept us solvent and stable and respectable in a neighborhood full of large, well-lit houses. And I thought about the dinner party where Warren had accepted a compliment for my garden. I thought about the heart emoji on WhatsApp. I finished what I needed to do, and I closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the warm lamplight, with my hands flat on the desk. There was no triumph in it, not yet. There was something quieter than triumph, a settling. Like the last piece of a very long and complex structure finally clicking into its correct position. The architecture was almost complete. What remained was timing, and I had always been extraordinarily good at timing. I turned off the lamp and walked back down the dark hall and slipped back into bed beside Warren, who had not moved, who slept on in his profound and untroubled way. And I lay in the dark and closed my eyes and thought, a few more days. Just a few more days of ordinary. A few more mornings of coffee and toast and WhatsApp messages. I would answer with 3 words or fewer. A few more evenings of the practiced smile and the navy dress, and the posture that said everything is fine here. And then the architecture would speak for itself. The Hendersons' anniversary party was not the kind of event I would have chosen under ordinary circumstances. A large catered gathering in a backyard strung with Edison lights. The kind of party where everyone knows everyone and conversation moves in overlapping circles of neighborhood gossip and professional one-upmanship. But Warren had accepted the invitation 3 weeks earlier without asking me, which was also not unusual, and I had decided after some thought that it was exactly the right stage for what was about to begin to become visible. We arrived at 7. The yard was full, the music low and tasteful, the catering staff moving through the crowd with trays of bruschetta and chilled shrimp. Warren immediately found his orbit, the cluster of men near the outdoor bar, Doug Henderson and to others I recognized from previous gatherings. The kind of men who laugh loudly and talked about their weekends with the expansive ease of people who have never had to account for their time to anyone. I watched him slide into that circle like water finding its level, and I thought, this is the last time you will walk into a room like this and feel that comfortable. I found Marian Okafor near the garden beds, a woman I genuinely liked, sharp, warm, a corporate attorney who had known me since before Warren and I were married. We talked for a while about her daughter's graduate program and a board position I had recently been approached about, and it was easy and real in the way conversations with Marian always were, and for 20 minutes I allowed myself to simply be present in it. Then I heard Warren across the yard. He was telling the story about the house renovation. I had heard him tell it before, the way he described negotiating with the contractor, the way he positioned himself as a decisive force behind decisions I had made entirely alone, down to the tile selection and the load-bearing wall consultation and the 3 weeks of phone calls that had kept the project from going $60,000 over budget. He was telling it with great confidence, and the men around him were laughing at the right moments. And Warren's voice carried that particular satisfaction of a man who believes his own narrative completely. Marian had gone quiet beside me. She had heard it too. She looked at me with an expression I recognized, careful, watchful, the look of a woman deciding how much she is permitted to say, and I gave her a very small smile. That told her everything she needed to know without a single word passing between us. She looked at her drink. She said, quietly, you know, Nora, you never talk about the business of these things. And I said, no, I don't. And she said, you should. And I said, I know. Later, near the dessert table, a man named Cliff, a financial advisor who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, asked Warren what he did professionally. The kind of question that circulates at parties like oxygen. Warren gave his standard answer, the title from the mid-level management position he had held for 6 years without advancement. And then he added, as he sometimes did, and my wife runs her own consulting firm, in the tone of a man acknowledging a pleasant hobby. Cliff looked at me with genuine interest and said, oh really? What kind of consulting? And I told him, cleanly, precisely, with the full scope of the client portfolio and the revenue range, and the 2 industry awards from the previous year. The silence that followed lasted only a moment. But I felt it. Warren felt it too. I saw it in the slight recalibration of his posture, the way his smile stayed in place while something behind his eyes shifted. A flicker of something he did not want to name. Not here. Not in front of Cliff and the Edison lights and the chilled shrimp. He laughed, he said, she's being modest, it's a serious operation. And he put his hand on my lower back in the way that men do when they want to simultaneously claim you and recover ground. And I stood very still under his hand and smiled at Cliff and said, yes, it is. We left the party at 9:30. Warren was quiet in the car. Not the pressurized silence of the restaurant. Something different this time. Something with a new edge to it. Something that told me the evening had landed in him in a way he had not yet processed. He did not reach for the radio. He did not hum. I looked out the passenger window at the passing streets, and I thought about Patricia's office on Monday morning, and the documents waiting for my signature, and the quiet, irrevocable machinery that was already in motion beneath the surface of every ordinary moment. The party was over. The real work was about to begin. It started with Hazel's laptop on a Tuesday afternoon while Warren was at work. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor with Miles beside her, both of them quiet and focused in a way that reminded me of when they were small children, working on a puzzle together. That particular sibling concentration, where the usual friction between them simply dissolves into a shared objective. I sat in the armchair nearby with my own laptop open, monitoring, present but not directing. This was their decision. I had not asked them to do it. I had simply told them the full truth, finally, the night before, and then I had gone to bed and let them process it together the way siblings do, in the private language of people who grew up in the same house and understood its acoustics better than anyone. Miles had taken it the way I expected, a long silence, then a single controlled exhale. Then a series of precise and practical questions that told me He had already moved past the emotional impact and into the operational one. He asked about the accounts. He asked about the timeline. He asked, with the directness of someone who needed the answer to be clear, whether we were going to be financially safe. I told him yes. Completely. He nodded once and did not ask about Warren again that night. Hazel had already known the shape of it, but hearing the full version, without the protective editing I had been applying for years, produced in her a stillness that was more unsettling to witness than anger would have been. She sat very straight and looked at her hands for a long moment and then said, "Okay, what do you need from us?" And I had told her, what I needed was clean, simple. I needed Warren's digital presence removed from the shared family infrastructure. The streaming accounts, the family photo cloud storage, the shared grocery app, the household calendar synced to all our phones, the emergency contact designations, the family location sharing that I had set up years ago for safety, and that Warren had never once looked at. All of it methodically and without drama, transferred or closed or redesignated. Not as an act of cruelty, as an act of accuracy. Updating the architecture to reflect the reality. Hazel worked through the list with the systematic efficiency of a business administration student who understands that process matters. Miles handled the technical side. He was faster with interfaces, knew the account settings the way his generation instinctively does, moving through menus and confirmation screens with the fluency of someone who has never known a world without them. I heard him say to Hazel at one point, quietly, "Did he even use any of these?" And Hazel said, equally quiet, "He used the one for restaurant reservations." Miles made a sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't quite, and then the cursor moved and the account was gone. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. When they finished, Hazel closed her laptop and leaned her head briefly against Miles' shoulder. A gesture so small and so complete that it compressed everything I felt about being their mother into a single moment I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. Then she straightened up and said, "What's next?" What was next was a conversation I had been postponing for reasons I now recognized as sentimental, rather than strategic. I called my sister-in-law, Warren's younger sister Dana, who I had always genuinely liked and who I believed, based on 20 years of observation, was clear-eyed enough about her brother to hear what I had to say without collapsing into loyalty she did not actually feel. I told her, briefly, and without theater, that Warren and I were separating, that the children were with me, and that I wanted her to know before she heard it from him. Dana was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Nora, I'm sorry. I'm not surprised, but I'm sorry." Which was, I thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. I thanked her and ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in my hand, listening to the house. It was mid-afternoon and the light came through the kitchen windows at a long angle, the particular gold of late winter sun that makes even ordinary rooms look significant. Miles was in the kitchen making a sandwich. Hazel was upstairs. The house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in years, not the pressurized quiet of managed silence, but something cleaner. Spacious, the quiet of a place beginning to belong to itself again. Warren would come home in 3 hours. He would walk into a house that looked exactly the same as the one he had left that morning. Same furniture, same light, same family. He would have no idea that its entire interior logic had shifted irrevocably while he was gone. That was the nature of elegant architecture. You do not see the structure. You only feel, eventually, that something has changed, and by then, the foundation has already been poured. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? Tell me below. Patricia Ossi's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. The kind of office that communicated competence without ostentation, clean lines, good light. A single large window overlooking the city, with the calm authority of someone who has nothing to prove. I had been there twice before, both times under the cover of business estate planning. Both times leaving with more clarity than I had arrived with. This time I brought Hazel. I had thought carefully about whether to include her. Patricia had advised me that having Hazel present for the signing was not legally necessary but was, in her word, meaningful. It established continuity of intent, created a witness to the moment, and gave my daughter something that could not be undone or reinterpreted later. I had agreed immediately. Hazel deserved to be in the room. She had earned it. We arrived at 9. Patricia was already at the conference table with the documents arranged in the precise order we had discussed over for months of careful preparation. She shook my hand and then Hazel's, and she looked at my daughter with the appraising warmth of someone who recognizes capability when it walks through a door. She said, "Your mother has built something very solid." Hazel said, "I know." Patricia smiled and said, "Good. Let's make it permanent." The documents were extensive but not complicated once you understood their architecture. The Domestic Asset Protection Trust, structured to hold the primary investment portfolio and the real estate I owned outright. Rental property in my name alone that Warren had never shown the slightest interest in. Purchased 11 years ago with a down payment from my first major consulting contract. The updated beneficiary designations on the brokerage accounts, naming Hazel and Miles as joint primary beneficiaries with equal distribution. The amended operating agreement for Nora Callaway Consulting LLC, formally designating Hazel as successor manager in the event of my incapacity, a provision that was both practically sensible and symbolically complete. And then, the inheritance document, the one that had taken Patricia the longest to structure correctly, the one she had revised 3 times to ensure it was unassailable from any angle. Warren's eventual attorney might approach it from. He transferred the entirety of the capital I had designated as family legacy, a sum I will not name here but which represented 22 years of invisible labor, compounded into a trust for Hazel and Miles with distribution terms Patricia and I had designed together over several long phone calls. Warren was not named. Warren had never contributed to the capital. Warren had, in the most precise legal sense, no claim to it. I signed everything with a pen Patricia provided, a simple black ballpoint, unremarkable. The kind of pen you use to write a grocery list. The ordinariness of the instrument felt appropriate. The most significant thing I had ever signed did not require a ceremony. It required only a steady hand and a clear-eyed understanding of what you are doing and why. Hazel signed where her signature was required, and she did it without hesitation, with the same clean efficiency she brought to everything. And when she set the pen down, she looked at me and said nothing, and I said nothing, and we did not need to. Patricia gathered the documents into a folder, and her assistant took them to be filed and notarized, and entered into the systems that would make them real in all the ways that mattered legally, structurally, permanently. Patricia walked us through the remaining steps, the notification process, the timeline, the certified letter that would go to Warren's address of record. Once one had established separate residency, she used the word elegant again, and this time I heard it differently, not as a compliment to the structure, but as a recognition of what the structure represented. 22 years of patience, translated into paperwork, silence that had finally found its permanent form. We took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the cold morning air. And Hazel tucked her arm through mine the way she had not done since she was perhaps 12 years old, and we walked half a block to a coffee shop and sat down at a small table by the window and ordered without looking at the menu because neither of us needed to think about it. She wrapped both hands around her cup and said, "Does it feel the way you thought it would?" And I considered the question honestly, the way she deserved. I said, "It feels quieter than I expected." She nodded slowly. She understood that quiet was not emptiness. She understood, because I had raised her to understand, that quiet is what remains when you finally stop carrying something that was never yours to carry alone. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary morning way, people and traffic in the low gray sky of a February in transition. And I sat with my daughter in the clean, spacious quiet of a thing finished, and I drank my coffee, and I let myself, for the first time in a very long time, simply rest. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 12 minutes from the house. Close enough that the children could reach me easily, and far enough that nothing about it overlapped with the geography of the life I was leaving. I had chosen it 3 months before I needed it, paid the deposit from the business account, and furnished it quietly over several weekends when Warren thought I was working, which in a sense I was. It had 2 bedrooms, large windows, and a kitchen with good light in the mornings. It smelled of fresh paint and possibility, which is the best thing a new space can smell of. Hazel and Miles had helped me move the essentials over a single Saturday. While Warren was at the golf weekend, he had been planning for months. A detail of timing I had not engineered, but had noted with the quiet appreciation of someone who recognizes when the universe is being cooperative. By the time Warren returned that Sunday evening to a house that contained his belongings, and none of mine, the certified letter from Patricia's office had already been delivered and signed for by the weekend mail service. He called 17 times between Sunday night and Monday morning. I answered none of them. I had advised Hazel and Miles to do the same, and they did, with a discipline that told me they had made their peace with this before I had made mine. He appeared at the apartment on a Tuesday evening at 6:43. I know the time because the building had a doorbell camera, and I watched him on the small screen of my phone for a full minute before deciding to go down. He was standing on the front step in the gray wool coat I had bought him 2 Christmases ago, hands in his pockets, and he looked, I will be accurate about this because accuracy is what a story deserves, diminished. Not dramatically, not broken in any visible way, but smaller, somehow. The particular smallness of a man who has arrived at a door he expected to open easily and found it does not respond to him anymore. I opened the building door but not the interior one. We stood on opposite sides of the glass panel, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Nora, please." Just those two words, and the weight in them was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. 22 years does not disappear because a document says so. I felt the weight. I acknowledged it to myself, privately, and I did not let it move me. He said he wanted to talk. He said he could change. He said the word please for more times in the space of 3 minutes in varying configurations, attached to various promises that had the structural integrity of wet paper. He said he loved me, which may even have been true in the way that some men love the architecture of a life, without loving the person who built it. He said the children needed their father, which was the one that required the most composure to receive without expression. Because my children were upstairs in that apartment doing their homework, and eating the dinner I had made, and they had not asked for him once. I let him finish. I waited until the silence after his last sentence had fully settled, and then I said, calmly and without cruelty, that the documents had been filed, that Patricia's office would be in contact with whatever attorney he retained, and that the process would be straightforward as long as he allowed it to be. I said the children knew where to find him if they wanted to reach out, and that was their choice to make, not mine to influence. I said I wished him well, and I meant it in the precise and limited way that you can mean something like that, not warmly, but honestly. He stood there for a moment after I finished, and I watched something move through his expression. Not anger, which I had prepared for, but something closer to the slow registering of a reality that had been true for much longer than he had known. The look of a man finally reading a room he has been sitting in for years. He said, "The accounts," and I said, "Were always mine." And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and there was nothing left to negotiate. He turned and walked back to his car. I stood at the door and watched him go, and then I went upstairs and washed my hands at the kitchen sink and called down the hall to ask Miles if he wanted more pasta. And he said yes, and I served it, and the evening continued. Comment what you think Warren deserved. I want to hear your verdict. The new house came 8 months later, not a large house. I had spent enough of my life in large houses to know that square footage is not the same as spaciousness. That a home can have 12 rooms and still feel airless if the wrong person fills it with his absence of accountability. This one was modest by the standards of the neighborhood we had left. A craftsman bungalow on a quiet street with a deep front porch and a backyard that backed up to a line of old oak trees. And it had the particular quality of light in the late afternoon that makes you feel, without being able to explain why, that time moves differently. Inside it slower, more deliberately, like it belongs to you. I am narrating this from the porch. That feels important to say. I am sitting in the chair I chose myself, drinking coffee from the mug Hazel gave me last birthday. White ceramic, no design. Just the word enough in small lowercase letters along the base, and the oaks are doing what oaks do in early spring. That slow and unhurried return to green that has always struck me as the most dignified form of persistence in the natural world. They do not rush. They simply continue. Hazel finished her degree last spring. She is working now in a firm that does exactly the kind of work she is built for. And she calls me on Sunday evenings and we talk for an hour. And the conversations have the ease of two people who have been honest with each other for long enough that there is nothing left to manage. Miles is in his first year of college, studying architecture, which made me laugh when he told me. A real laugh, the full kind, and he texts me photographs of buildings he finds interesting. And sometimes I text back a single word that means I see it, I understand, I am paying attention. The trust is structured and funded and managed by Patricia's office with the kind of quiet, permanent reliability that good legal architecture provides. The business continues. Nora Calloway Consulting LLC, now in his 12th year, steadily, and without drama, generating the kind of income that has never required anyone else's name beside it to be real. I took on 2 new clients in the fall. I turned down 3 others because I no longer need to say yes to everything, which is perhaps the most significant form of financial freedom available to a person. Not the freedom to acquire, but the freedom to decline. Warren retained an attorney as expected. The process was, as Patricia had promised, straightforward, because the architecture was unassailable and Warren's attorney was competent enough to recognize it. The inheritance went to the children without contest. The rental property remained mine. The investment portfolio remained in trust. Warren walked away with what was legally, technically his, which turned out, after 22 years of contribution that had been entirely one-directional, to be considerably less than he had assumed. That was not cruelty. That was accounting. I heard through Dana that he had moved into an apartment across town and was In her careful phrasing, recalibrating. I did not respond to this information with satisfaction or with sympathy. I responded to it with the mild, impersonal acknowledgement you give to weather. Something happening at a distance in conditions that no longer affect your forecast. Here's what I know now. From the vantage point of this porch and this morning and this particular angle of spring light, through old oak trees, silence is not weakness, patience is not passivity. The woman who carries everything without complaint is not doing so because she has no other option. Sometimes she is doing so because she is building something, carefully and without interruption, that will outlast the noise around her by decades. The most powerful position available to a person is not the loudest one in the room. It is the one who understands the room completely and has already planned the exit and furnished the next space before anyone else knew there was a door. I bore the burden alone for years, I did. Every brick, every payment, every invisible labor that kept a life standing that only one of us was invested in maintaining. I bore it in silence because I was not ready, and then I bore it in silence because I was preparing, and there was an enormous difference between those two silences that took me a long time to understand and that I now carry with me as clearly as my own name. My name is Nora. I am 48 years old. I have two remarkable children and a trust in their names and a company of mine, and a porch with good light and a mug that says enough, and it is, it genuinely, completely is.